The following video will be a critique of Gods Will Be Watching, a game created by two-man team Deconstruct Team and published by Devolver Digital onto Steam on the 25th of July 2014. The game is a resource management simulator which forces the player to make difficult decisions in separate crises and which is tied together with a fairly unique narrative. This is a game which does some very clever things and some very silly things, all of which will be elaborated on in the fullness of time. This video contains spoilers regarding the game's narrative and its mechanics, and all gameplay was recorded on easy difficulty. We'll begin by talking about the game's background and creation. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy what you hear. This game's development history is relevant to its presenting problems because it encapsulates everything that the game is now as well as its overall issues. Gods Will Be Watching was developed for Ludum Dare 26, a game jam whose theme was minimalism. The original game was the story of the survival of a group, stranded on a hostile planet. You needed to provide for their well-being, keep the fire going, keep morale up, keep your people fed, and repair the radios so you could get off the planet and back to safety. The rub here is that you could only perform 5 actions per day before the sun went down. This made the original game very tough and very interesting to play. One of the options that players had was to kill a member of the camp. They'd no longer consume resources, but then you'd lose access to their unique skills as well. The same could happen if a member's morale got too low. They'd break down mentally and run into the woods. Once you've taken all this into consideration, your party needed to survive for 40 days. Not 20, not 30, but 40. The original game balanced story and mechanical twists quite well, and it's no surprise that it came second in the game jam. Good work, Deconstruct Team, and nicely done. However, this is only the beginning to our discussion. After receiving critical acclaim for the level and after crowdfunding, the game was expanded and turned into a commercial title. This means that its resource management mechanic would be applied to different scenarios, which were all tied together by an overarching plotline. The result is that the player is given 6 vignettes based on the resource management theme, controlling inputs and outputs in order to satisfactorily pass the level. These metrics can be anything from the amount of data you hack from a government server, the progress towards a cure for a virus, or the amount of water you have while you're walking through the desert. It seems promising, and it is, but it's hampered by a few specific problems. Firstly, the introduction of random variables into the levels means that the intricate balance of mechanics can be upset very easily. In the first chapter, hostages can get up and attack you with very little mechanical indication. In the second chapter, there's a game of Russian roulette, which means that if the random number generator is capricious enough, you'll be forced to restart the level entirely. In the third chapter, the code you're looking for is randomized repeatedly. In the fourth chapter, you can be attacked by predators. In the fifth chapter, it's very possible for your target camp to be spawned further away from your starting position than is possible to reach in the deadline. The introduction of randomized elements pollutes the otherwise intensely cerebral experience of playing and completing the game by learning and understanding its mechanics. Imagine it like building a house of cards, painstakingly assembling a towering edifice of individual units, balancing the forces and the stresses on each side, and just as things are starting to take shape, someone knocks it over and shits all over it. This is the first problem I personally have with the game's design. The second issue I and a lot of other people have is the game's unforgiving nature. This comes back to the issue with mechanics. Despite the use of random elements, each of the game's 6 levels features a slew of interacting systems that all work in an intimately linked fashion. The tutorials for these systems are pointedly concise, and they can leave players twisting in the wind a little before things get figured out. This stems into the game's third problem. It espouses trial and error as a learning style. This isn't simply an unfortunate side effect of sloppy decisions, but very deliberately baked into the game's mechanics. The character, Sergeant Burden, even goes so far as to state that he's fought this battle a million times before, as a very legitimate threat when fighting the game's final boss, and it's literally the only way to beat him. Figure out his attack telegraphing and exploit that by failing and learning. Given the game's plot, this is either at worst a game's attempting to excuse itself through a narrative conceit, or at best a kind of meta-commentary on the nature of games, especially difficult ones. How many times have we been beaten back by a tough puzzle, an overleveled boss, or a complicated set of platforms only to attempt it again? I'm not trying to presume anything here. Nobody likes having failure thrust into their face, and iterating on failures is a very relevant educational strategy that both fosters creativity and addresses mistakes, but this once again comes back to the issue of randomized variables. If I fail in Dark Souls, it's because I didn't react appropriately to a certain enemy or a boss. If I fail a chemistry test, it's because I didn't know how to answer the questions. If anyone fails anything, it's because they don't understand the systems at work. But we can always learn those systems and try again, and oftentimes come out on top. This is all well and good, but for introducing random elements. Randomizing things, especially when there are often more than 5 systems going at once, is a fucking terrible take on trial and error gameplay. It means you're always chasing this white rabbit, getting ever and ever closer until at the last moment something may very well knock you over and shit all over you. Some people might be into that. I personally am not. In spite of this game is very, very absorbing. I'm a stickler for resource management and monitoring games, and having so many things to take care of, monitor, and progress makes the game feel like a game of chess. Every scenario has one uniting resource: time. Time is consumed when the player executes an action that's related to the game's resources. This can be anything from actually collecting resources to holding a child at gunpoint. If your actions have an impact on the world around you, then they consume time and move the game forward. You can only ever execute one action per time unit though, and all of the other processes move forward on their own. This means that there's a lot going on while you can only really manage one thing at a time, which is kind of like real life. As far as this game's concerned, this time-based progression does a marvelous job of building tension. To return to the House of Cards metaphor, you can only hold one pair of cards in your hands at any one time, so if something goes wrong, you have a choice. Either try and salvage what you can, or run around and try and fix everything. It's this feeling of running around, constantly being behind the ball that makes this game thrilling, not a constructed scenario that makes me choose between where I throw a baseball, but the fact that things start falling apart one by one around you, and in trying to save everything you end up screwing yourself over. Sun Tzu said, "To strengthen every part is to weaken every part," or something like that, and this is very true here. It's nigh on impossible to 100% this game on a single run-through, and trying to do that is going to run you headfirst into problems. This is where the morality aspect of it comes in, being forced to make decisions out of essential pragmatism rather than from composed set scenes. Do I kill someone and cannibalize them to keep the rest of the team alive? Which human member of the team do I use to test potentially lethal medication? Do I kill a soldier because he's slowing me down and my water's running low? Do I use a child as leverage in a hostage situation? This is how you make moral decisions. Reinforce them with mechanics that punish the player either way. Don't play on emotions, but tap into the game itself. The choices you'll find in Gods Will Be Watching far surpass the effectiveness of moral choices in BioShock or Mass Effect because they are mechanically driven rather than emotional. And there's a very intimate link between the narrative and the systems that propagate that narrative. By way of example, in Chapter 5 you need to guide a squad back to their base camp, navigating the desert to do so. One of your soldiers is critically wounded, and you have the option to kill him, which increases your traveling speed. However, killing him means that some squad members will abandon you, leaving you at a disadvantage when you run into enemy patrols and camps. You lose either way. The game is changed for your input, and that's how you feel consequences. Add to that the game's presentation in a minimalistic pixel art style and a soundtrack that underscores the tone and atmosphere at hand, and you've got an experience that's wholly unique. It's a shame then that there are some serious inconsistencies throughout the entire game. For example, no character can be killed off permanently. They just reappear in the next scene as if nothing happened. I'm serious. Think about it this way. Lose Jack in the torture scene and he's right as rain for the next one. You can then inject him with drugs, kill him, autopsy his corpse, and he'll be right as rain for Chapter 4. Then you can kill him again, cannibalize him, and use him as food for your party. This kind of immortality goes for every other member of the team, even the dog. This is because each vignette is supposedly balanced in order to make it a self-contained scenario with its own mechanics and its own nuances. This means that eliminating a character to ensure narrative consistency would upset the mechanical arrangement. Kinda like taking an instrument out of an orchestra. You're gonna miss the tubas eventually. The game presents some beautiful arrangements for the player in order to facilitate thoughtful play and action, but that play hamstrings itself with its own inconsistencies. It's this problem that characterizes the game. It's filled with good ideas and concepts, but these gems, these moments that carry so much gravity, are buried in a mire of turds that you need to dig through again and again. Let me present a case example. The first level. The level has you managing hostages while you hack into a government computer. You need to maintain your connection, manage the hostages' level of stress, keep the guards off your back, as well as occasionally boosting your hack via a chargeable ability. Executing one action means every other process moves on regardless. Reinforce your security, and the hostages get more agitated. The guards advance another few steps as well. Calm the hostages, then your security goes down and the guards advance again. Order your man to fend off the guards, a hostage attacks you, you need to kill him to progress, but now you only have 3. Calm the hostages again, your connection is lost, and you restart. The next time, you end up killing all the hostages and you lose the level. You fail, and you restart. You will always restart because this is the only way to beat the game. Mess with the mechanics enough to break them, and eventually you'll learn how to abuse them. Each scenario is composed of some very smart ideas, but from a mechanical standpoint, they're all presented very obtusely. In this case, instead of fumbling around with the hostages, just have your rifleman attack the guards. Sure, it raises the hostages' panic level, but you have the breathing room to reset their panic meter by talking to them, check your security, and you even have some space to charge your hack boost. What just happened there is that I started abusing the mechanics of the game to get past the level, because at that point I was tired of playing through the same experience over and over. I rejected the immersion of the game and cheesed the systems. This is something that's going to happen to a lot of people at either the 1st or the 5th chapters, which is where a lot of people stop playing and walk away. The 5th chapter encapsulates everything that is wrong with the game. You're supposed to guide a squad of soldiers through enemy territory, managing supplies, stamina, and avoiding enemy patrols and camps. The problem here is that every single zone is randomly generated. Every single zone. This means that winning the level is less down to skill and more down to pot luck. It's the single most broken level of the game, and it's entirely possible to spawn right next to your destination. Look at this breakdown here. This is presented at the end of each chapter in a Telltale Games-like summation of how people address the challenges of each chapter. You see this statistic right here. Fastest time, 2 hours. 2 hours. Average time, 154. Now granted, these are in-game hours, but that difference in time represents either a half hour or 10 minutes worth of play in real time on a successful run. That's not saying anything about how many times you have to restart a level, or simply have the game crash on you because it ran out of memory. It might take you 12 hours to complete the game from start to finish, but if you tally up all of your successful runs, you end up with about 2 hours of actually successful play. At 6 scenarios, this means an average of 20 minutes to complete, and this is most likely what a full playthrough of the game looks like if you watch it on Twitch or YouTube. It's the random element, the obtuseness of the mechanics, and the trial and error aspect of the game that makes this a problem, and it's lampshaded in the extreme in the final boss level. When you fight Liam, Burden tells him that he's fought him a million times before, that he's going to win because he's going to learn how Liam fights and use that to beat him. This isn't just the character speaking, it's the game, reminding you once again that you need to lose to this guy in order to beat him, because you need to learn how in failing. While I might appreciate this mechanic for its triteness, at this point, after 11 hours of repeated trial and error, this is not intelligent design. It's subverting the irritation caused by literally hours of fruitless trying by putting it into a plot twist. The thing is, though, that the plot twist kind of makes sense given everything the player goes through in the game's first 5 levels. The story proper concerns Sergeant Abraham Burden, a soldier fighting for the ECUK who infiltrates a terrorist organization as part of a covert operation. This organization, Xenolifer, steals a biological weapon to be used as a bargaining chip in a struggle for alien independence, which is the first level of the game. Burden and his buddy Jack are captured, and after escaping their interrogation, they're assigned to a science team to find the cure for the bioweapon. The problem is, Xenolifer steals the cure and leaves them stranded on an alien planet. Burden and his team manage to get off planet, but Xenolifer is already deploying the bioweapon, and the logical response to this is to launch a suicide mission to save the world, of course. This leads to a flashback, which explains Burden's origin story, and then things get kind of meta. It turns out that Burden's been trapped in a time loop, which has forced him to relive the same 7 years of his life over and over again, going through the same experiences while making different choices. This whole reveal is presented in a big cathartic explosion that sees Burden think back on everything that's happened in a series of flashbacks, over and over again, until he supposedly embraces his present, beats his nemesis, and completes the game. At this point, he floats into a black hole as the credits roll. Synopsis complete. This is, at its worst, a solipsistic way of saying that none of your decisions mattered at all because it's all just a loop and you did everything because, yay, emotions. At best, it's a subversion of the moral choice system as a whole because it doesn't matter at the end of it. All of these choices, like the characters themselves, exist in a universe wholly defined and limited by the rules and systems which form the scope of the game. What it also does, however, is invalidate every single decision you've made over the course of the game in a terrible moment of self-referential wall breaking. The decisions we make are irrelevant because Burden's just going to end up here anyway. We know this is a game. It's an escapist fantasy in which we engage in order to entertain ourselves. Self-referential humor only serves to undermine the experience as a whole, and it's not at all effective here. But this game advertises itself as having moral dilemmas. What worth are these dilemmas if the game itself admits to their invalidity, especially when the main character and our manifestation in the game directly states that he doesn't care? In attempting to tie a subversion of games and game mechanics into the narrative, the game makes itself worthless. This itself is lampshaded a second time in the epilogue, where we see Burden stand up, put on a shamag, and stroll off screen before... Which is another way of saying it'll all play out again if you play the game a second time. Same scenarios, same mechanics, same narrative. This all reinforces the idea that Burden's going through the same story again and again. The reason he can't remember anything of his life is because his life literally does not exist outside of the scope of the game, and is meaningless regardless because we know how it's all going to end at the conclusion anyway. To say that replaying is an optimistic assumption is a bit much, so I'm going to leave that there. This game has a lot of excellent ideas executed in a very poor fashion, and while this is sad, there's some scope for improvement here. Why not take the framework of this game and apply it to real-life crisis simulation? Show people just what emergency responders, firemen, doctors, and police have to go through by turning those crises into these same terrifying tests of pragmatism that we have in this game. Given the game's production values, it's hard to think of something that could do a better job of both conveying a sense of encroaching dread and vague horror through its pixelated graphical style and amazing soundtrack by Fingerspit. Once again, link in the description. It's not a wholly bad game. It's good while everything works together, and in those rare moments of synergy, things really do seem thrilling, tense, and terrifying. It's just a shame that more often than not, these interplays are undercut by the same design choices that gave them life. This game is amazingly deft at the way it ties mechanics into its story, but then hamstrings itself horribly by that same association. It's a beautiful harmony of aesthetic, mechanics, and narrative, but for some unfortunate elements, the whole thing crumbles to nothing, like a house of cards.